Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We had lunch. It tends to be chilly in the morning and night. We now soon have a final exam and a vacation. How do you see your progress in college life? Okay? Okay. As usual, I prepared a printout to cover this class discussion entitled Intellectual Property License, and was accepted the book I once introduced, chapter 14. So you now have a scope of outlines about key rules and principles, and also some of cases pertinent to understanding of basic rules, and also very helpful tips dealt in a box format, as you see on of the pages. For example, checklist for intellectual property transfers, checklist for explanations of common license clauses. It made some point in focus on transactions, compliance with export laws, for example, merger or integration clause, limitation of liability, exclusive remedy clause, and so forth. And also, you have a very good guide in the provision of case highlights. So you may have the ideas about rules and laws upheld by the court in most notable cases. So I consider it would help to penetrate through the discussion of the course. So in this class, we expect to review the intellectual property license. In the last class, we explored some basic rules about intellectual property law in national and international dimensions. So American laws, patent, copyright, and other trade secret laws, some of a special statute to respond with the transformation of technology, kind of a social consensus. So it is actually interesting for the policymakers. As you see, often we have some ideas to be oriented about equality of liberty or public value, the kind of a key principles the public policymakers or administrators need to adhere with would be imposing. Right? So you see there is some more scientific ways to discuss in ensuring a justice. Social equity and justice also key themes. So that kind of deliberation need to be coming to popular point. As we cross the public agenda. So, for example, how much extent is due for the intellectual property right holders? It is quite a kind of a quasi property right, hence need to be protected in terms of civilized notion of law. However, in some cases, public value may be mediated to negotiate between public interest. For example, it is one of standing understanding about the rule on public domain. So it often be excluded in terms of scope of legal protection involving intellectual property right. And also the duration of a protection may be a question into negotiation or compromise. So much enhanced form would may contravene the what involved interest in imbalance. In any case, we need to have an awareness about some of fundamental nature found in a TRIPS agreement, as you see, and the context would now be interwoven with enhanced form of international trade relations. So, concept, rule of law about international economy has highly been forefronted, as you see in the advent of adaptive governance. And it actually new ways to deal with the technological advancement and some rules and practice of international community about protection of intellectual property. In this class, we be relate to the scope of a review which involves intellectual property licensing. So often business enterprises, as I've said, rely on the contractual device to promote their business, to practice their commercial performance by various ways of a contractual device. So the intellectual property owner often exploit this device, a contract, to facilitate the commercial purpose. So they often execute licensing agreement to assign or transfer the rights to use or sell the produced goods, manufactured goods based on technology and also. Of course, the intellectual property right holders intend to hold their rights as an ownership, in terms of ownership. So they own the right. They never sell the intellectual property rights in a normal situation. So they need to devise kind of a contract design to address their problems and their interest in reduced form of contract, which would not be, however, short and extensive, since the legal response to ensure added protection would only be possible by the contract, with the terms and conditions spelled out in very extended form to address the relationship. So it often bears lengthy pages of contract, and we will further review the typical clauses often incorporated into the intellectual property agreement. And I also remind that the Korean Commercial Arbitration Board provides online the forms of model contract related with various forms of international contract. So you may find two versions in English and Korean about sales contract, for example, and also a construction contract. And it is indispensable, of course, that they offer the model contract about intellectual property agreement, licensing agreement, technology of transfer. So you see in the projection also actually tough to discern the words in the outline. So intellectual licensing, and actually you see protecting intellectual property rights is very concern, which is very sensitive for the businesses or property owners. That is because the intellectual property law often expose some of varied forms across the jurisdiction. National laws differ. In some countries, more enhanced control by national authority would be practiced. For example, compulsory license, kind of a legal concept which is very restrictive to the notion of a developed nations, however, may be seen as a kind of a social justice in case of a socialist or a developing countries. So, for example, the working requirement may be strictly enforced to avoid that kind of a radical measure by national authority. In contrary finding, the national authority may officially endorse the compulsory license for third parties to practice the technology. So the national laws heavily diverge, which arouse the fear for the property right holders. So in intuition and strategy, they would get better to prepare a kind of a protective contract, you see. And you see the notion in subtitle, preventive, preventive due diligence. It is kind of a practical tip, and also indispensable, I consider, to arrange the international investment in the kind of order and in as much as a profit context. So they are required to survey the national laws pertinent to their dealings. Typically, the types of intellectual property rights to avoid the unexpected failures, and also they need to undertake a kind of a scrupulous process to make a effective negotiation and to reach a reasonable and not adverse to their interest. Reasonable outcome is important to ensure. That it could be only be secured by exercising due diligence, which is in a preventive aspect. Actually, the transfer of technology is kind of a limited engagement in carrying the international business. The most typical and paradigmatic would be often involved by selling the final product itself. That is more extended form of an international transaction. However, for many reasons, the U.S. firms or other influential, commercially large scale of enterprises may explore the limited context of interaction. For example, transfer of technology, that is one way. In that context, it is key points in consideration. The property right is entitled due protection, and the contractual device would be often effective, since the national laws would not be a bright line. Transparency may be less to be ensured. So kind of illusion need to be standard. Okay? So once a patent, copyright, or trademark is obtained, the holder is free to assign, transfer, or even mortgage those rights. The license agreement is the most common means of transfer. The intellectual property agreement or license takes on added significance in international transfers, and the contract must provide avenues for lawsuits for breach of contract where an infringement claim is unlikely to be sustained, the foreign intellectual property laws. The licensing of technology, intellectual property rights, and know-how create some of the more complicated and detailed contracts in international business transactions. National laws that restrict the types of clauses that cannot be incorporated within a licensing agreement further complicate the license writing process. Some of these restrictions are discussed later in the class. For example, we see the EU response to restrict the kind of a free technology of transfer to the nationals. They impose some of reasonable steps to keep balance among types of a mutually adverse in some cases, or reinforcing in others. Kind of a mediated role of these statutes is important, and most often they are mandatory that the contract itself obliterate. It's a mandatory provision to regulate in binding power the contract. In some cases, it may be submissive to the stipulation of both parties. So we also have that eyes to distinguish the quality of provisions. And also we have some renewed statute, new statute, which is very challenging and promising about computer information. The US case to actually cultivate the area of international transactions, and to address the problems and points of issues often being manifested in the technology transfer agreement about that area. You see, Uniform Computer Information Transaction Act. And also we need to have basic points about the law of licensing. UCC CIST, as we have learned, most representative norms to recourse. So mixed sale articles, for example, indicate the software sale contract are to be considered sales of goods unless a preponderant part of the obligations of the party who furnishes the goods consists in the supply of labor or other services, or the purchaser supplies a substantial part of the materials. So often both norms are committed in extended scope about sales of goods, tangible products. So technology would not be directly intermediated into kind of points, often focused by those norms. However, we may see the kind of intermixed nature of transaction. The concept also is pertinent when we see the hybrid license. The concept is interesting. As you see, the practical complexities of international transaction may require the parties to license separate types of intellectual property. For example, you see the use of a trademark or service mark may be coupled with the transfer of a patent or trade secrets, for example. In that case, we need to heed on precaution about the antitrust law, what we often term a competition law, for example. So the royalties or other kind of arrangement needs not to be grossly disparate between the parties in the interest to one party, or severe injustice to the other party. That would fail the fair notion of play and may be redressed by national policymakers in terms of a fair trade law or competition laws. So we also have the kind of public law to correspond with a basics of the international requirements, as you see. And we may consider a vertical restriction of a free business ideas, you see? And horizontal context of restriction in what economic injustice and might be due to some of a imbalance in bargaining power. So the kind of injustice is one subject that national policymakers may now entertain what they concern. And also it is now termed as one of new agenda in the WTO commitment. So competition round are actually included in one strand, as you see, what, for example, green round and blue round. What is blue round? It now assailant in increasingly there may be negotiated pivotally with a international trade, you see, an environment issue. Also a blue round, for example, it denotes the international commitment about the labor standard and also labor issues. They are actually kind of a environmental concept when we see the WTO in the perspective of a pure economic organization. However, the kind of a subsidiary contention may be entangled with economy. So that context was lastly vindicated when we incorporate the technology issue into WTO TRIPS agreement as notable in that line of thought. So the economic center may expand the concern into other areas of international contention. So anti-corruption is also one point the international policymakers are sensitive to redress. So the United States and other developed countries now incorporate that virtue and proposition of international community into the national laws. So it actually requires faithful obedience of nations in the international community. However, the progress would not be straightforward in countering force, counteractive resistance, resilience from many countries. And also the European Union's TTBER, technical transfer guidelines may be one alternative to ensure the interest. And we have some brief about regulations of the People's Republic of China. So the technology issue is very sensitive for national policymakers, as I have already iterated. So they practice a governmental intervention by means of approval or registration. So two types of response would be typical, as you see. Approval type response and a registration response. In some cases, particularly for the communist countries, the registration may be required to make it a valid contract between the parties. So, in contravention with the registration requirement, the contract may fail to be formed. In any case, it is at high profile or practical relevance to enter into the contract. That is because it is it is wisest way to advance the commercial interest and ensure a due protection, added protection from normal dealings of national laws. And you see in pages a typical clauses often expressed in the license agreement. For example, it begins with preamble and recitals. And recitals often be the basis for misrepresentation of others. So the first statement or breach of a recitals, which was a vote by the parties in entering the contract will lead to some damages, typically. So reciters are statements of facts pertaining to the parties and the nature of the transaction. They often list the rights being transferred by the license. Any untruthful reciters can become the basis for lawsuits asserting breach of warranty or misrepresentation. Because of this, the licensor should verify the status of all its trademarks, copyrights, and patents, along with any patents pending. Definitions explain the meaning of general and technical terms such as exclusive license or net sales. Because of differences in language and culture, definitions take on added significance in an international transfer agreement. The extra care should be taken in defining terms in the definition section of an international transfer agreement. And also, the technological license agreement incorporates a territory clause, and it actually bears a significant aspect to determine the destiny of licensing. So, for example, parallel import may jeopardize the business in the domestic market. So, the type and geographical limitation needs to be carefully negotiated in defending his commercial interest. It defines the appropriate sales areas or distribution channels for the licensed product. If the license grants exclusive territory, then the license cannot grant other licenses the right to sell in the exclusive territory. The licensor will generally want to restrict the licensee's ability to sell products outside the licensed territory. So, actually, the national policymakers would consider it is licensee-friendly or licensor-friendly. So, this parent privilege for the license may violate the fair trade terms designed by national policymakers. So it is kind of a subtle subtlety to ensure a operation of justice and also a reasonable commercial profits in the context of a transaction. And also the license agreement may set forth a covenant not to compete. So this way of dealings would often be veritable across commercial practices. However, as said, it also may incur some of an unacceptable context of injustice against the licensee. So the covenant should be designed in reasonable manner and a acceptable extent of a promise. Much like U.S. courts, foreign courts highly scrutinize and limit these types of clauses. The licensor often requires such a clause to prevent the licensees from competing against it after termination of the license agreement. Article 2096 of the Italian Civil Code typifies the restrictions placed on covenant not to compete clauses. Such clauses are required to be in writing, be limited to certain geographical area and activity, and not exceed 5 years in duration. Italian court generally favor the licensee in narrowing the restrictions pertaining to area and activity. So the restrictive business practices often be questioned in commercial policymakers and adjudicators, as you see. So it deserves a care and attention in understanding this area of inaction. And also, you see many clauses that may be employed to issue a due protection, for example, loyalty clause and guaranteed consideration, or the momentum loyalties, and also kind of a grant back clause is often be agreed upon and practiced, which may be subject to some of a strict scrutiny about its fairness. What is the best efforts clause? It is one way to exact the loyalty of a licensee, and of course it is intended to preserve the quality and reputation in the international sectors of commercial community. And also it is one way to prevent any neglect or undue shortcomings in practicing the license agreement. So the licenses may like to insert this clause. The loyalty clause is negotiated around three general parameters: the loyalty rate, guaranteed consideration, and momentum loyalties. The general royalty rate is based on a percentage of sales determined in one of two ways. The use of gross sales generally favors the license, and using net sales favors the licensee. However, the practice may moderate differences between two types. As you see, for example, the distinction between gross sales and net sales is not always significant. The net sales definition that allows very few offsets or deductions will result in a figure very close to a gross sales amount. Conversely, a gross sales definition that allows a liberal number of deductions can result in a figure that resembles a net sales figure. And guaranteed consideration may operate to ensure a minimum amount to be retrieved by the licensor. So it is paid when the licensee sells at a product line. These royalties are based on increases in license overall sales. We now consider a momentum royalty. So it is kind of an antithetical concept against the guaranteed consideration. Momentum royalties may take the nature of bonus in corporates or firms. So paid when the licensee sells other product lines. These royalties are based on increase in the license overall sales due to the introduction of the new or licensed product. This notion is similar to the rental provisions in commercial leases to base the rent on the tenant sales. Momentum royalties are negotiated in licenses of market products that are likely to draw customers to the licensee's other products. Guaranteed consideration may be scheduled payments, including a good faith deposit, not connected with sales by the licensee. Guaranteed consideration ensures that the licensee will make reasonable efforts to produce, market, and sell the licensed product. The licensee should negotiate that any advance payments have to be credited against a future royalties. So we are on page 494. The practice would be that a best efforts clause would often be inserted, you see. And it also may bring the kind of contention about compulsory license arising from a non-use. So it is important not to fail to work license. Granting a license to a national of the country usually satisfies, however, the so-called working requirements. The threat remains, however, that if the licensee fails to work license, the licensor will lose its right to other parties through the government's granting of a compulsory license. A best effort clause should therefore require that the licensee work the license. And transparency in the licensing relationship should be provided for in the license agreement through the insertion of accounting and record-keeping requirements. So it involves a long-term context of a contract. You see, a technology transfer. And also one kind of hybrid license may be identified in a franchising agreement. You see, the provision of goods and authorization to use trademarks or service marks, and kind of a program about education and skills improvement. And besides the franchising agreement, we often also see the technology transfer would be exploited along with a long time sequence. So it is important to ensure a transparency in relationship between two parties. So accounting and record-keeping requirements need to be understood in entering the contract. What standard and how extent of details may be required to communicate and maintain the integrity of a partnership. Of course, it is not actually a partnership, and often the non-partisan partnership confirmation may be made by inserting the clause. However, it requires quasi extent of a fiduciary duty, often found in a partnership agreement. The accounting provision should call for periodic statements of sales and royalty payments, as well as some form of a certification and audit of sales amount and royalties owing by an independent accounting firm. The licensor should demand a payment of interest on delinquent payments and assurances in case of default. The licensee should be required to retain records pertaining to the license and the sales of the licensed products. And in technology transfer agreement, we also allocate our time and efforts to draft the indemnification clause. And other concept which is important is disclaimer, warranties, and representations. The context is very complicated and poses a multifaceted challenges, since it involves the kind of a quasi-property right, which is actually exclusive against other users. So the probabilities of buying some of litigation or suit from other third parties would not be negligible. See, very in chances the licensee or licensor may meet the kind of a threat from the suits. So it is interesting for the licensee to draft the indemnification clause carefully to protect the due interest in balance. Often the licensor like to prevent the loss and damage by engaging in the kind of suit or litigation to defend the interest of licensee. However, the litigation, of course, is centered on the issue of the validity of a license, or the kind of scope of a protection to be infringed by third parties. So it bears a close relationship that the licensor may engage in the suit as a party, or may share the cost incurred by responding with the issues or litigations. So there would be a scope of levers to leverage this kind of a problem in terms of allocation of risks and cost and other interests. You see, so the licensee should be required to take all reasonable measures to protect the license, copyright, and trademarks. The licensee's duties in this area, detailed in an infringement clause, should include affixing the appropriate marks and patent numbers to the products being licensed. So we later discussed the case, Yahweh Corporation versus Eurocontrol USA. The court in this case held the licensor has a cause of action, damages resulting from the licensee's failure to mark goods as required under the license. In the area of third-party infringement, the infringement clause places a number of obligations on the licensee. First, the licensee should be made to act as the eyes and ears of the licensee, because it is in the best position to detect infringement. The licensee should be required to notify the licensor promptly of acts of infringement by third parties. Second, the licensee's cooperation in any infringement proceeding should be required under the transfer agreement. The license agreement should also detail the rights and duties of the respective parties in the event that the third party sues the licensee for infringement. So in this case, we may class two types in its nature. It might be licensee friendly, and it may go otherwise, which would be a licensor friendly. So the licensee friendly provision would be an express covenant requiring the licensor to defend and indemnify the licensee against such claims. The license friendly provision, on the other hand, would exclude or limit the license obligations regarding such infringement claims. So one compromise, as I said, would be to grant the licensee the right to indemnification, but limit the indemnity. For example, sharing the cost incurred by litigation authors. And in other cases, the licensee can limit its exposure by declaring the option to pay a specified amount to the licensee and terminate the license instead of defending the licensee against an infringement claim. This context was revealed in the case in fine scope of issues, as you see later, in case titled Hewlett Packard Company versus Bosch-Lomb Incorporation. In this case, the court upheld such limited indemnification. And another company, as you can surmise, would be an agreement to share the cost of defending any third-party infringement claims. The licensee is obtaining the right in the license agreement to sue third parties for patent infringement pertaining to the licensed property is not sufficient to give a standing to sue under U.S. patent law. So it is a fairly esoteric area you need to heed of. Actually, the patent right or copyright holders, so the intellectual property holders entertain kind of a quasi-property right. So the court perception is very restrictive. The patentee licensor would only be entitled to be named as a party in this kind of a litigation. So the patent license or the assignee of patient is exclusive party. And the license only grants to the licensee merely a privilege, not a right in strict legal terms. And the privilege protects it from a claim of infringement by the owner. So it is interpersonal to be sold for the license dues. So his claim is limited to the licensor. It is not exclusive against all the world of other parties. So he is not entitled to sue. The patent owner may tolerate infringers, and in such a case, no right of the patent licensee is violated. So it is interesting, and the kind of interplay also arises from no challenges clause. So if the transfer agreement was entered into and the parties mutually agreed upon the terms and conditions, then the licensee no longer challenge the validity of a license. That serves the business purpose of a property, intellectual property holders, of course. However, that also may contravene our sensibility of justice. How do you consider? So this area of a balancing would be keenly interwoven with the kind of a public policy, a fair trade notion. Yeah? So economic justice between two parties who are on different foot of economic capacity, you see. So the U.S. Supreme Court has long recognized that the patent owner is an indispensable party to an infringement suit. Courts have also held that granting the licensee the right to sue for third-party infringement does not create any obligation on the part of the licensor to assist in such action. In this regard, it has been held there is no implied agreement by a licensor to protect the licensee by sui. In the absence of a covenant to protect the licensee against infringers, there is no obligation on the part of licensor to do so. Courts have, however, recognized the right of an exclusive licensee to demand that the licensor join him as an involuntary plaintiff to an infringement action. This is an indirect way to give the exclusive licensee standing to sue for infringement by third parties of the licensed intellectual property rights of the licensor. So the court has a different, court made it distinct between exclusive and non-exclusive license in terms of its status about infringement claim from other parties, third parties. And to best protect this interest, the licensee should negotiate a clause requiring the licensor to either sue third-party infringers or to join the licensee in any such actions. The clause should state the repercussions for the licensor's failure to fulfill its obligations under the clause. For example, it may authorize the licensee to sue on behalf of the licensor and require the licensor to reimburse the licensee for the costs of litigation or provide a discontinuance of the payment of royalty fees. So this issue was contended in the case titled Fieldwood Incorporation versus Southwest Recreational Industries, which is our task in the next class. So we now see it plausible and also required to consider the past and present infringement in arrangement of between the parties. So language has been held to defeat the allegation of an implied retention of the right to sue by the licensor, which is very important to define the rights and duties between the parties in this area of concern. You see? So the parties to the intellectual property licensing agreement must specifically identify the rights that are being transferred to the licensee. What scope of rights would transfer? So how much extent of a exclusive right was granted by the licensing agreement. So the extent would actually be shaped by mutual agreement. So in some cases, the licensor may incorporate the language to transfer entire right, title, and interest in the intellectual property to the licensee. In that case, the court may see it in ample scope to favor the licensee. Also, it may consider it to be positive that the licensee, while he's not a patent licensor, may be entitled legally to respond with a third-party claims. So actually, the validity and infringement of a license, popping around this area of concern. So how we hover the concept into kind of a express terms is very important. So reduction into express language in contract would save much predicament that could be brought up. And also we may encounter the parties' strategy to insert a pertinent negations. So warranties and representations are often be preserved that the justice may be allocated in fair terms, and the licensor would be cautious about warranties and representations, and also like to know how much is be entitled to scope of disclaimer. So the licensor should like to protect itself through a disclaimer or limitation of warranty applicable against the ultimate purchaser or consumer. The licensor will want to insert language requiring the licensee to obtain customer signatures agreeing to the disclaimer or limitation. And also you now know the UCC has some rules about the valid scope of disclaimer, and requirement normally has to be present to make disclaimer valid in legal terms. And also particularly in the transfer technology transfer agreement, the licensor may like to prevent the implication of warranties, and by inserting pertinent negations. An example of negation includes the statement that the license does not grant the licensee the rights to any subsequent know-how or to additional technical support or information. Another negation may preclude the licensee from using the licensor's trade name. The problem with negation clauses is the licensor with a U.S. patent cannot be assured that the negation clause will be enforced under a foreign law. So actually the structure and concept of civil law, private law, would differ in some cases. So specific agreement about negations may not inure to the parties in any effective or binding context, you see. And also, in some cases, the general clause of civil code or a public law on fair trade may intervene to invalidate the kind of arrangement, negations. So often, the licensor who considered a superior in terms of a bargaining power may impose the interest, may like to impose the interest and the kind of privileges. However, they may checked up with the kind of in a respective national context. So it also required and necessary to survey, as I've said, national laws in care and strategy. Actually, to carry the international transactions involves many points, strategy and tactics and practical points to be visited in facilitating the commercial purpose. And also, the technology transfer incorporates, as you see in projection, which is which usually comes into play in this kind of contract. So assignment of a sub-licensing clauses. Actually, the assignment of sub-license may transform the quality of a contract in any different fashion, and also vary the underlying assumption, often fundamentally. So it is the point to be negotiated specifically to raise a practical feature. So, for example, a prior consent need to be safeguarded to preserve the integrity of contract. And also, the transfer agreement often contains the non-partnership and independent contract clause, which makes clear that the licensee is not acting as an agent or partner of the licensor, and hopefully preventing the licensor from being held liable for the actions of the licensee and the agency law principles. So it may mislead the parties with different understanding. For example, the licensee may see it kind of an agency contract, and the court may impose its views if it intends kind of similarities position against the partnership orders. So it is helpful to foreclose any possibilities about that drifting away. So non-partnership and independent contract clause may work to prevent kind of a misconception between the parties. And also in this type of a licensing agreement, often the parties enter into the agreement on grant-back promise. They provide clauses which requires the licensee to transfer the improved technologies to the licensor as a matter of law. So it is binding in nature, and the licensee is obligated to transfer the improved skills to the licensor. Also, that raises the need to review in terms of a fairness. You see, so this area of a transaction is a popular subject. The policymakers have a keen attention about economic justice. So any improvement of technology made by the licensee to be assigned back to the licensee is considered invariable. And the most technology transfers in some cases. But most countries allow a grant-back clause that is reciprocal or non-exclusive. So the quality would not be the same if the arrangement is reciprocal or non-exclusive. In a reciprocal grant-back clause, the improvements made by either the licensor or licensee are to be shared with the other party. And in common licensing clauses, you also find two important clauses, confidentiality clause and choice of law clause. And the kind of clause also be viewed and classed as a boilerplate clause. It frequently the scope of intellectual contract in the end of a contractual contract document, and commonly operable to address the challenges and problems which arose in the same context, notwithstanding the types of contract. What is a confidentiality clause? It restricts access to the technology to a limited number of key personnel of the licensee and prohibits any further disclosure of confidential information to third parties. Many licenses require licensees to have all their employees sign separate confidentiality agreements. So actually, it may be scrupulous, but impose a harsh contrast against a normal level of a commercial transactions. It is individually required to sign separate confidential agreements. It may be sold in terms of a private right or others, kind of a excessive restriction on business practices and personal freedom. Most developing countries insist on a broader dissemination of technology to its citizens, and therefore often limit the scope of confidentiality clauses and agreements. And the license agreement set forth a forum selection clause or choice of law clause. One law governs the contractual relationship between parties. And what code in jurisdictions, many jurisdictions may be responsible at the forum. So it may be agreed upon in advance. And of course, may be negotiated later after the dispute arose. However, it is actually seldom, you see. So often the contract of technology transfer spells out in advance kind of the forum selection clause and other points. And important so that is one subject. The international trade lawyers often play a role to give their advice. So it is important for the business people to refer to the professional counsel when they explore to conclude the contract. Forum selection clause designates the law of the licensor, a licensed country as the place of dispute resolution is likely to be disregarded by the courts in a developing country. The approval authority in a developing country generally requires the transfer agreement be subject to the jurisdiction and law of the host country. So it has said China and Russia could be notable about a public intervention into private arrangement, technology transfer. So registration or approval may be required. And often approval also be practiced in very dominant context of a national authority. In addition, most licenses desire strict territorial provisions, limiting the licensee to selling only in the territory specified in the license. An export restriction clause is generally inserted to prevent so-called gray market problem, as I said, in which goods are made more cheaply in one country and then exported to compete against licensed own goods or those of other licenses. So, suppose the interest of a developed commercial merchants in developed countries. So they have now some of a very practically strong patent items, and they like to sell patent to the other countries, China and Korea. It is actually threatening if the technology may be coupled with the cheap labor. So the product, if a parallel import may be permitted in any abusive way, not restricted by illegal terms and conditions, may rival out the licensor company. So now the gray market problem and parallel import is a central point of contention about international business. So restrictions on export may be invalidated under foreign competition laws or under technology transfer laws in many developing countries. So the national police often see it implausible and abusive to transgress the freedom of a business operation. It one concept in consideration of human rights, freedom, free trade economy. Generally, developing countries aggressively promote the export of goods, acquire hard currencies, and improve the balance of trade. So this point also aggravates the context of a parallel import. So often the borrowing country of advanced technology will see its prospect of a greater exports. Foreign competition, technology transfer, and consumer protection laws cannot be avoided through contractual agreement. For example, some foreign contract or consumer laws limit the scope of disclaimers or limitation of liability clauses. Thus, the international licensor must determine what impact such laws or only differences in customs and trade uses will have on the operation of standard licensing agreement. So in the beginning point, we take the overview about the license grant and limitations. In fundament, the license agreement purported to grant the license, patent rights, copyright rights, and also it would be designed to impose some limitations about its use or other ways to exploit the intellectual property. Therefore, the single most important clause in any intellectual property, technology, or software licensing agreement is the grant clause. It describes the rights and know-how being transferred, along with any restrictions or limitations on their use. The licensor should emphasize that the licensee is being granted only the right to use the items being transferred. So the grant clause should limit or prohibit the licensee's right to copy the licensed material, prohibit the licensee from reverse engineering, state that the licensor retains title to all copyrights, patents, and other priority rights, call for the licensee to seize using the information upon termination and for the return or destruction of all copies. So the licensor need to consider carefully about the post-termination measures. For example, in some period of time, the confidential information need to be kept secret also, although the contract was terminated. And also, some context of response need to be ensured about return and destruction of all copies. So long-term engagement in the transaction would let the parties to be extensively exposed to the others in terms of technology and confidential information, and may develop the kind of a tangible setup or documents about during the carriage of their business. So the remnants upon termination of contract, which may militate against the interest of a licensor, need to be redressed. For example, return or destruction may be clearly expressed in the contractual provision. And the grant clause should itemize the IPL and know-how being a transfer. Reference exhibits that are attached to the agreement is common technique. The grant should make clear whether the license is exclusive or non-exclusive. The difference is fundamental to issues regarding the degree of competition that the licensee may expect and in setting royalty rate. Also, exclusivity is interconnected to issues dealing with infringement. In an exclusive license, as we have reviewed, the licensee should negotiate the right to demand that the licensor sue any third-party infringer, or the right to sue in the name of the licensor for any infringements in the licensee territory. So, in this class, your awareness needs to be from this key point. The law applied to intellectual property transfer is multi-layered and complex. So, 4 areas of applicable law need to be studied. Where the home country law applies extraterritorially. Whether an international convention can be used to protect the property being transferred. Whether the foreign host country's laws provide a sufficient protection. Whether host country laws regulate the content of the licensing agreement. So the extent as we surmise may vary across the nature of a country and its national policy. And you'll see the checklist for intellectual property transfers. A licensor's due diligence checklist should include determining whether the transfer agreement or license needs to be approved by an agency of the licensee's government. Some countries, like the United States, require the registration of the license with a government agency, as we have considered. And in the box titled Focus on Transactions, you see checklist for intellectual property transfers. For example, how is it arranged? How is it to be arranged in patents transfer. What are the time remaining on the patent terms? A patents being used in countries that require working. And we also need to identify all US and foreign patents associated with the transfer. Such US and foreign patent office records for title and payment of all necessary fees. Also, we need to identify all markings to be used in conjunction with the production of the licensed product. Then, how about the trademarks? We see forestry identify all federal, state, and foreign trademark registrations and pending applications. And we also require to check title and payment of renewal fees, for example. And we also have to provide licensee with samples of proper use of trademarks. So it complies with the fair notion of a transaction, and also enhances our duty in terms of the face and fiduciary dealings. And we also need to review copies of all product, advertising, and promotional materials. And also, we may inquire, has there been any period of non-use of trademarks? So, a thrift agreement and most of national laws about a trademark often emphasized the aspect of non-use about its revocation or others. So this aspect needs to be seriously examined. Are the trademarks and any license pertaining to them transferable or assignable? As I have said, the copyright or patent actually are entitled to legal protection right upon the creation of that element, as you see, for example, invention, what else? So registration would not be a prerequisite to entitle the invention or copyright products to be protected by laws, patent law or copyright law. However, it, as I've said, serves the practical needs of parties, and we also consider the U.S. Copyright Act, which allows the registration of licenses and transfers in the Copyright Office. Doing so gives the licensee important benefits. Section 205C 1.2 of the Act provides that the recording of a copyright transfers constitutes a constructive notice of facts stated in the recording. This becomes important in the event that the copyright owner transfers two conflicting licenses. The section 2005D states that the license that is recorded force will prevail even against the licenses that granted at an earlier date. And section 204A of the Copyright Act states that the transfer of a copyright ownership is invalid unless the instrument of a transfer is in writing and signed by the owner. Transfer of copyright ownership is broadly defined in section 201D 1.2, include the granting of an exclusive license. And also we may apply the basic rule about formation of contract, for example, statute of fraud. So how these rules about formation of contract may interact with a conclusion of a intellectual property contract, and also interesting, you see. And typically, the advancement of e-technology also bring a complicated aspect about a valid contract. So the electronic signature or authorization may be required in some cases to make the contract into any validity, you see. And also the domestic laws of the United States requires the licensing agreement to comply with the statute of fraud requirement. So must be reduced in writing to make the contract valid, for example. Okay, I may leave some of other areas of discussion about the new statutes and international conventions, which would be for next class. And also, we are required to review the cases left and there in next class. Okay. Actually, it's interesting, and I have noticed some of interesting story about mayors and governors. Often, the other countries in the West may see is kind of a misconduct or unethical behavior, what improved in with a politicians. However, the context actually different in Korea, as you see. Previously, we have many public surprise about prosecution of entertainers who use the propofol, kind of cocaine, and also recently we have stored some of well, actually acute entertainment who now probed in commercial criminal investigation about gambling. Actually, now the world is fairly competitive and put many strains and pressures to college students, entertainers, particular uses in the range of college students, cities, actually seem vulnerable, I suppose, to miscarry their person. Actually, the world is now transformative. Of course, wide range of many human and societal strengths. For example, we now engage in discussion of business or economy. We have many new types of businesses. For example, entrepreneurship lecturers who have long been seldom, but now multiplied in number, conduct public lecture and present the version to successful others with tactics and strategies in task. And also we often sad netizens who are so intoxicated into use of internet device or others. The kind of pressure may lead the politicians, leaders, public leaders, or popularities we see in grand content to this kind of unethical cocaine. So actually, the contemporary profile of transformation may pose challenges for both. So we need to be reflexive about phenomena and others. We later in this class advance to discuss, for example, new statute shaped in the European authority, and also we now deal with the American response with the tech transfer of the computer information, and also so impermissible exposure of the product right, kind of a misappropriation of trade secret, or in some cases customer list may be infringed upon in the interest of the perpetrator. So the standard of ethics often apprehended very importantly in understanding the laws and what the standard of society. Now get on turbulence, actually. Turbulence, you see. So it is also squeezing to respond with some of adequate standard to govern the internet society and others. So often in the end of a legal discussion, you see the new advent of online practice and public measure to respond with. So we now get into the gray season, winter season. So I like to encourage you to be reflexive personally, and also refresh yourself to be more competitive and resilient, and also in some cases courageous to manage. Just a tip. And so I expect this question or filled out. You write down your name. Thank you for your attention. And somebody may not recover the printout because of his absence. So then you may follow up in my office. I regret to. The female student was asked to. Okay. Then see you in the next class. Thank you for your attention.